Commodities. Our world is quite literally built around them. But what are they really? How do they define our lives? Are there any secrets contained within? And what can they tell us about the course of history?
Karl Marx, one of, maybe the most influential thinkers in all of history. Has any other philosopher influenced not just ideas and culture, but movements, actions, revolutions and wars, the courses of entire governments, countries and continents?
Understanding Marx is key to understanding the political and economic waters that we still swim in, and leads to a big question. Do we still live in Marx's world?
He was reportedly a towering intellect. One contemporary said, "Imagine Rousseau, Voltaire, Holbach, Lessing, Heine and Hegel fused into one person, and you have Dr. Marx." Another said, "Marx himself was the type of man who is made up of energy, will and unshakable conviction." His life was one of exile, secret societies, intense study and poverty. We'll try to unpack his most important ideas and some of the most common critiques.
Because most people misunderstand Marx, or at least misunderstand what he was truly trying to say. Most would associate him with communism, of which he actually had very little to say. What he sought to understand was capitalism, commerce, markets, industrialization and technological progress, and the question, importantly, of what makes us truly human.
Marx absorbed and thought through all of the trends and ideas around him. But what was most new in his writing was that it wasn't thinkers that could change the world, but action by ordinary working people.
To understand what that really means, we're going to have to go on a journey across history, from churches and fields to factories and cities. We need to understand where Marx was coming from.
Marx was a great synthesizer of the trends, movements and ideas around him. He was born in 1818 in Prussia, modern-day Germany, just after the French Revolution, Napoleon and the spread of new liberal ideas about freedoms and rights. New sciences, industries and factories were spreading across Europe. It was a time of unprecedented dynamic change. Change is key to Marx, and to understand change, there was no better person to turn to than Georg Hegel. Hegel had argued that all previous moments in history were the unfolding of ideas, concepts, truth, dialectically, moving us, propelling us forward.
Okay, I'm going to have to simplify a bit here, but for Hegel, this truth was an idea, idealism, images and words and concepts that led slowly across history to a greater understanding of the world and the universe, better political systems, more freedom.
The source of all of this, ultimately for Hegel, was God. Now, Hegel was still alive when Marx was young, but to young radical admirers, Hegel had become a dull, conservative, reactionary figure. He believed in progress, in rights, in freedom of a kind, but he also believed in order, in monarchy, and in religion. To a younger generation, these were all oppressive forces. A loose group of young intellectuals called the Young Hegelians emerged, who were influenced by Hegel, but sought to go further than their old master. They were much more republican, liberal, and democratic. Over time, they mostly got more radical, tending towards revolution rather than reform. This was a century of reform and revolutions, minor and major, successful and failed, from America to Germany and wider. The problem was that many radicals in Europe didn't really know what to do, what to replace the old aristocratic system with. The French Revolution, for example, had, in its most radical phases, failed. The young Hegelians started with religion. They believed it was oppressive, and they attempted to remove God from Hegel's system. Two thinkers in particular, Bruno Bauer and Ludwig Feuerbach, were the most influential critics of religion of the time.
Hegel had argued that that unfolding of history was the product of God revealing themselves through time, that we are all products of the creation of God, and slowly come to know the universe, science, the world better. And so, in a way, we kind of return to God, but expansively.
But to the young Hegelians, this positions ideas as kind of up there, above us, transcendent, unfolding down to us. In other words, we imagine a God that is the creator of us, all-powerful, directing and guiding us, but is also unreachable.
Feuerbach argued that when people did this, they were projecting. God is the sum total of the imaginative powers of our species projected onto some all-powerful being. Instead, we should recognise this for what it is, our imagination. Religion is the dream of the spirit, he said. It actually disempowered us by displacing some of our thoughts onto some supreme, unreachable being, instead of attributing them to us as a powerful species.
In his book on Marx, political theorist Alexander Kalinikos writes, Feuerbach argued that Hegel had turned something that is merely the property of human beings, the faculty of thought, into the ruling principle of existence. Instead of seeing human beings as part of the material world, and thought merely as the way they reflect that material world, Hegel had turned both man and nature into mere reflections of the all-powerful absolute idea.
In other words, by attributing our ideas to something outside of the world, particularly as supernatural religious phenomena, we alienated something within ourselves. It makes our thoughts not our own, not come completely from us. It falsely presents them as coming from God in the form of commandments or origin stories or church or political authorities. They thought it held us back.
Friedrich Engels, Marx's lifelong friend and collaborator, wrote that Feuerbach placed materialism on the throne again. He reminded us that ideas are the products of real physical human lives. They come out of us, out of our flesh. Bruno Bauer was even more radical. He argued that by asserting that the world was the product of God's will, we justified the world as it was. Poverty, God's will. Kings and despots, God's will. In short, religion obstructed change. It justified the world for good and for bad. From Bruno Bauer, Marx would develop his famous idea that religion was the opium of the masses. It says, yes, life is hard, but that is God's intention, and don't worry, you'll be rewarded in the afterlife, rather than instead maybe encouraging a more progressive idea of history that sought change.
Now, here's an important part. These young Hegelians were still, well, Hegelians. They still believed in the power of ideas. They just thought you needed better ideas, more rational ones, more truthful ones, to replace the old, repressive, wrong ideas.
Another young Hegelian, the early anarchist Max Stirner, argued that bad ideas were spooks, bad thoughts that haunt the mind, and Marx criticised this approach. There are two significant early works here, On the Jewish Question, published in 1843, and The German Ideology, published in 1845.
It's all well and good advocating for religious freedoms and property rights and liberal ideas like freedom of speech, but all of it, ultimately, in the end, leaves the real physical, material lives of ordinary people untouched.
For Marx, it wasn't enough because once the holy form of human self-alienation has been unmasked, the first task of philosophy in the service of history is to unmask self-alienation in its unholy forms. The criticism of heaven is thus transformed into the criticism of earth, the criticism of religion into the criticism of law, and the criticism of theology into the criticism of politics.
Many, including Hegel and Rousseau before him, thought that the state could be above society, kind of, natural, general, negotiating fairly between different interests, neutrally. But like the young Hegelian critique of religion being kind of up there too, supposedly neutral, but actually connected, Marx saw the same argument applying to the state.
The French and American revolutions had made the claim that everyone was equal in freedoms, before the law, in speech, and that this political equality emancipated people. As the philosopher Leszek Kolakowski puts it in his book on Marxism, purely political and therefore partial emancipation is valuable and important, but it does not amount to human emancipation. But what does emancipation really mean if some had nothing, were starving, had no land or means or resources, were taken advantage of in other ways? We need to think about what emancipation means. Marx wrote that a liberal revolution would liberate only as an individual withdrawn into himself, into the confines of his private interests and private caprices, and separated from the community. Instead, a social revolution could offer human emancipation. Marx thought that the Declaration of the Rights of Man was a big step forward, but is not the final form of human emancipation. He continued, just as the Christians were equal in heaven, but unequal on earth, so the individual members of the nation are equal in the heaven of their political world, but unequal in the earthly existence of society.
Politics must become concrete. He asks, how can liberty just mean the right to not be interfered with, or the right to acquire as much property as possible? What does that kind of liberty mean if you have nothing?
Marx writes, none of the so-called rights of man, therefore, go beyond egoistic man, beyond man as a member of civil society, that is, an individual withdrawn into himself, into the confines of his private interests and private caprice, separated from the community. In our time, all the inaccessibility of politics, the endless talking in parliaments and congresses, the debates and the distractions, the dramas, the sensationalist press, all pull away from the very real material issues in people's lives. The idea that we all have freedoms, can go where we want and say what we want and vote how we want, but actually, when you look at it, it really depends on what you have, on who's on the ballot. There are so many more things that matter than just formal rights, and this is what Marx was starting to get at.
He was beginning, in his own words, to invert Hegel, to bring his ideas down from the heavens to the dirty, gritty, physical, hard earth.
In The German Ideology, Marx criticised his young Hegelian contemporaries for believing that ideas can change the world on their own. This was ideology. It distorted thinking and concealed the real issues going on underneath. Kolakowski writes, ideology in this sense is a false consciousness or an obfuscated mental process in which men do not understand the forces that actually guide their thinking, but imagine it to be wholly governed by logic and intellectual influences.
Again, it ignores material, sensory, physical life.
For Marx, freedom, progress, should be understood as, quote, power, as domination over the circumstances and conditions in which an individual lives. Ridiculing idealism, ideology, the idea that ideas were dominant, Marx quips that once upon a time a valiant fellow had the idea that men were drowned in water only because they were possessed with the idea of gravity. If they were to get this notion out of their heads, say by avowing it to be superstitious, a religious concept, they would be sublimely proof against any danger from water. What he's saying is that gravity is not just an idea in our heads that if we change through debate or rework in our minds that we can get rid of and then fly and walk on water. Gravity is very real. It's material, it's in the world. It affects us rather than us affecting it. And he's saying that there are other things, human things like that too. That people moving about, eating, producing, doing things, working, affects ideas, not the other way round. Summing up his critique of the young Hegelians, Marx famously wrote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it."
The Romantics were another influence. They had argued, just a generation or so before Marx, that much about modern life, industry and politics seemed to separate us from what they saw as a kind of natural wholeness. Marx was a romantic in his early years, like many others, then and now. He wrote bad romantic poetry in his 20s, and he came to the Romantics primarily through Hegel. Hegel took the idea of unity and completeness from them, that a person should be able to develop themselves fully, three-dimensionally, in a relationship with the world around them, rather than feeling disconnected from it. In other words, Romanticism was about a striving towards a completeness. It was about being at home in the world. The opposite to this was alienation, feeling estranged, disconnected from the world. Hegel said that individuals are in a torn and shattered condition. Marx had a complicated relationship with this idea. When he was young, he hated Hegel, accused him of mystification and obscurantism, but he came back to him later, turned him upside down, and some say, as we'll get to, abandoned him, at least in part, later on. Understanding alienation is crucial because it was fundamental to Marx's development and to many ideas of the time and since many critiques of the modern world. So what exactly is it? In his book on alienation, the philosopher Richard Schacht points to several definitions. According to one, alienation is avoidable discontent. Another is that it's a feeling which accompanies any behaviour in which the person is compelled to act self-destructively. And another that alienation points to some relationship or connection that once existed, that is natural, desirable or good, and has been lost. But the word that comes up most in the early Marx's writings is estranged, hinting at something that is either no longer close that once was, or isn't close that should be. Things being disconnected, separate, when they should be connected, integral. It comes up in several ways. First, money. Money is alienating because it's a stand-in for the real social relationships that are hidden underneath it. It disconnects us from them, it hides them, it hides the social reality. It becomes what he calls an alien medium instead of people being the mediators themselves. It separates us as a species. Money is, quote, men's estranged, alienating and self-disposing species nature. Money is the alienated ability of mankind. But labour is estranged and alienated too. What workers do all day is for someone else, on something for someone else. What they're doing is out of their control. They are estranged from it. Even their own bodies can become alien to them, as they're forced to sell their labour to stay alive.
I like to think of it as a kind of zombified state on the factory line, doing something for no good reason yourself except to afford to stay alive. Marx says the object the labourer produces confronts them as something alien, something independent, which stands over and against them. Kolakowski writes, the alienation of labour is expressed by the fact that the worker's own labour, as well as its products, have become alien to him. Labour has become a commodity, like any other. On top of that, the division of labour means workers don't even work on or understand the entire product line. They're divided into small, disconnected parts. Marx writes, not only is the specialised work distributed among the different individuals, but the individual himself is divided up and transformed into the automatic motor of a detailed operation, thus realising the absurd fable of Menenius Agrippa, which presents man as a mere fragment of his own body. Capitalism, he says, converts the worker into a crippled monstrosity. In On the Jewish Question, Marx writes that while humans are supposedly equal in the political realm, in everyday life, the worker, quote, degrades himself into a means and becomes the plaything of alien powers.
But, and here's the key, according to Hegel, we produce, project and create the conditions of our own alienation as a species. Then, by recognising that condition, we aim and work to overcome it. In other words, that progress arises out of the discontent of alienation itself. The bad becomes the good. Negativity, alienation, it's part of us. We have to overcome it, and it drives us forward.
Kolakowski writes, the greatness of Hegel's dialectic of negation consisted, in Marx's view, in the idea that humanity creates itself by a process of alienation, alternating with the transcendence of that alienation.
But remember, Marx flips Hegel on his head. For Hegel, that process was in the realm of ideas. For Marx, it's material. It's about the real conditions on the ground. Who's doing what, where, for who, in what ways. It's how alienation confronts us in physical objects and processes like money, like labour, in bricks and mortar. Kolakowski writes that the true starting point is man's active contact with nature.
And Petrucciani says that man is not only a natural sensuous being, but that specific being which self-produces itself through historical labour and through the dialectic of estrangement and reappropriation that characterises it. It's a process of creating our world, producing it, seeing problems in it, being alienated in it, and then working to address it, to change it, to revolutionise, to move through it dialectically. In his early writings, Marx leant heavily on the concept of alienation. Some argue he abandoned it later on, as it wasn't a rigorous enough scientific economic concept. Some, like the French philosopher Louis Althusser, argued that you can divide Marx into an early stage and a later, more mature one. Others, like David Harvey, disagree. Petrucciani also says that while the early ideas become more precise, reformulated and filled with content, they're never abandoned. While Kalanikos writes that in the early work of Marx, everything is built around the contrast between human nature as it is, debased, distorted, alienated, and as it should be. But this begs a question. How can you possibly know what human nature should be? Surely everyone's different. You can't get an ought, a moral, normative claim about the world, out of an is, a how the world is, a description of the world at the moment. If you could, wouldn't that be idealism? Positing an ideal out of the mind about what the world should look like. Exactly what Marx sought to critique in The Young Hegelians.
Marx's problem with alienation can be imagined like this. You say, capitalism alienates us. I say, from what? You say, well, from natural selves. I say, like Adam Smith did, that capitalism is natural because human beings have a natural desire to trade and exchange and barter. You say it's not natural to work in a factory all day. I say it's not natural to wear clothes or shoes or farm. And on we go.
This is called the naturalistic fallacy, that we place an arbitrary dividing line between something natural and something unnatural, when in fact everything in some sense comes from the earth, everything changes, everyone is different. Marx tried to get around this problem with the concept of species being.
For Marx, there isn't a magical, spiritual, natural human essence that's repressed by modern society. Instead, he imagines human society as a whole at any given time. Everything humans are doing, arguing, being, and then he contrasts an individual, the individual, with that.
He wrote, "The essence of man is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In its reality, it's the ensemble of social relations. Our essence as a species, our species being, is precisely that we can recognise ourselves as part of a species, as part of a totality of our economic systems, cultures, politics, our history, and so on." What he's saying is we have an idea of our species in our head that comes from the material reality of our species and then our relationship to it, what's possible. And so we can become estranged and alienated from that. A natural society shouldn't be something cooked up by philosophers like Plato did in the Republic, designed, laid out, engineered and planned. Society is a process that's happening right now. It's always happening, it's always moving. It's about that development, the development of it, and how we relate to it. Philosopher Lloyd Easton writes, "Marx particularly warns against establishing society as an abstraction over against the individual. The individual is a social being as the subjective experienced existence of society."
What you need then is to find a philosophical process that moves from alienation to a world in which everyone is in some way connected to, has some control over, is served by our material species being. That the individual and society are not estranged from one another, but in development with each other. And it's around this time that Marx starts calling himself a communist.
In his economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, a set of notes not published until 1932, and maybe the least catchy title of all time. If it was a YouTube title, it would be something like, "You won't believe these 10 secrets about wealth and wisdom." Anyway, Marx wrote that communism was the positive transcendence of private property as human self-estrangement, and therefore as the real appropriation of the human essence by and for man. Communism, therefore, as the complete return of man to himself as a social, i.e. human being. Communism should be the achievement of a real community. Under communism, the contradiction between the interest of the separate individual or individual family and the interest of all will, according to Marx, be overcome. Communism should be the genuine resolution of the conflict between man and nature, and between man and man, the true resolution of the strife between existence and essence, between objectification and self-confirmation, between freedom and necessity, between the individual and the species. Again, many argue that this language of alienation and species being was largely abandoned in those later works, but whether that's true or not, they were indisputably the influence, the driving force at the beginning, and I think the most influential commentators seem to disagree that there was a break between the early and late Marx anyway. Kolakowski holds that there is no discontinuity in Marx's thought, and that it was from first to last inspired by basically Hegelian philosophy.
Social being estranged, alienated, individual development repressed, then recognition of that, reconciliation, return, and then emancipation. For Marx, this new focus on material conditions, social relations and physical life demanded a new method to understand capitalism. The old philosophy just wouldn't do. He's fascinated by stuff that's not adequately captured by reflecting on ideas, wood, machines, protests. He borrows from Benjamin Franklin, for example, the notion that humans are a tool-making species, that's what separates us from animals. Engels studies the working conditions in and around his father's factories in Manchester, where he works. Both are working to bring philosophy down from the heavens.
For a long time, peasants in rural France and Germany had a traditional right to collect wood and twigs from the forest for their fires. But in the 1820s, as enclosures were happening and capitalism and property rights were expanding, laws were passed that ended these ancient rights. Remember, Hegel and Rousseau had argued that the state, the government, could be a neutral representation of the general will, of everybody's interests, unbiasedly.
But it was in these new wood theft laws that Marx saw the obvious problem with that logic. The government, in banning the collecting of wood to keep warm by poor peasants, were taking the side of wealthy landowners over ordinary people.
In other words, the state became the vehicle for the propertied class who held economic power above all else, and against, quote, the poor, politically and socially propertyless. Engels later wrote, I heard Marx say again and again that it was precisely through concerning himself with the wood theft law and with the situation of the Moselle peasants that he was shunted from pure politics over to economic conditions and thus came to socialism.
It was in wood, in tools, in material that the truth of alienation could be found. If peasants and labourers were kicked off the land, if all of the countryside was enclosed into plots to farm by the wealthy, if the peasants had no tools or no machinery or money of their own, no resources, what would happen? They'd be forced to sell their own labour.
Here was a key and classic distinction, and those that had nothing, that the exclusive ownership of the tools, the machines, the means of production was one of the keys to prosperity, to flourishing, and to overcoming alienation.
Again, this is what's special about humans as a species. We make tools, that the projection of an idea onto a material object that helps us survive better and better is key to our historical development.
He wrote, the animal is immediately one with its life activity. It does not distinguish itself from it. It is its life activity. Man makes his life activity itself the object of his will and of his consciousness.
We till, sow, fence, build. We enslave with chains, we engineer, we innovate. These are the things our lives are quite literally built around. They make up our materiality, our material existence. They help us, or at least some of us, to overcome our limitations, our fleshy limitations. And they have a dynamic, changing, shifting history.
He writes, "Men have history because they must produce their life, and because they must produce it moreover in a certain way. This is determined by their physical organisation. Their consciousness is determined in just the same way."
This is the basis of Marx's materialism, that it's our material, physical, sensory, social, productive lives that matter. This may seem accepted or obvious, at least in a large part today, but when economics as a field was very new, all of this was very novel.
Most would have argued, and did at the time, that it was leadership or intelligence or great thinkers that determined the course of history and people's lives. Napoleon, a great military strategist; Plato, the great philosopher; religion, the teachings of divine scriptures and prophets. Marx was arguing to the contrary. The economy mattered most. It determines everything else. He wrote, "Men, developing their material production and their material intercourse, alter, along with this, their actual world, also their thinking, and the products of their thinking. It is not consciousness that determines life, but life that determines consciousness." This led him to the nascent field of economics, and his brilliance would be to combine economics with philosophy. The newspaper he had edited in Germany had been shut down, he'd moved to Paris but been kicked out, and now he was in exile in Britain. He spent months in the British Library poring over economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, and recording whatever he could find, filling notebook after notebook.
He borrowed several concepts that we'll come back to, but he was immediately critical too. From his Hegelianism, Marx believed that everything was connected, that no man was an island.
Adam Smith, trying to understand the logic of the new commercially driven societies developing across Europe and America, started from the assumption of natural, individual self-interest. That it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, he wrote, but from their regard to their own interest. In other words, selfishness could create value. Marx hated this. He wrote, "Production by an isolated individual outside society is as much an absurdity as is the development of language without human beings living together and talking to each other." He called people like Smith Robinsonards, that they assumed each person was like a Robinson Crusoe on his own little island, being productive without any influence from wider society. Kallinikos writes, Marx criticised the political economists because they tended to treat society as a collection of isolated individuals lacking any real relation to one another, so that, quote, "the limbs of the social system are dislocated." Another trend which immediately dissatisfied Marx was their tendency to naturalise commercial society as timeless. Smith, for example, thought humans had a natural tendency to truck, trade and barter, and that the market was the natural result of that. Again, drawing on Hegel, Marx saw this as absurd. History clearly changed across time. Capitalism emerged from somewhere. He wrote, "Economists have a singular method of procedure. There are only two kinds of institutions for them, artificial and natural. The institutions of feudalism are artificial institutions. Those of the bourgeoisie are natural institutions."
They failed to see how there was nothing natural about them. Human societies changed over time, and human life was embedded in that societal context.
He wrote, "The sensuous world around him is not a thing given directly from all eternity, remaining ever the same, but the product of industry and of the state of society, and indeed a product in the sense that it is a historical product, the result of the activity of a whole succession of generations, each standing on the shoulders of the preceding one." So this was how Marx proceeded: economics plus Hegel. This idea of development, change, of progress was the fashion of the day. In 1859, for example, Charles Darwin published his On the Origin of Species, his theory of evolution. Marx later wrote, Darwin has directed attention to the history of natural technology, i.e. the formation of the organs of plants and animals which serve as the instruments of production for sustaining their life. Does not the history of the productive organs of man in society, of organs that are the material basis of every particular organisation of society, deserve equal attention?
The key was to try to understand how capitalism unfolded as a system. It wasn't that the lion and the deer, or the worker and the capitalist, were just in competition with each other, separate from each other, but that they were part of the same totality, the same system, and that system had to develop and change in a connected way, dialectically.
He was comparing biological organs to economic organs. He was comparing flesh and plants to machines and industry. He summed up his method like this: my dialectical method is, in its foundations, not only different from the Hegelian, but exactly opposite to it. For Hegel, the process of thinking, which he even transforms into an independent subject under the name of the idea, is the creator of the real world, and the real world is only the external appearance of the idea. With me, the reverse is true. The ideal is nothing but the material world reflected in the mind of man and translated into forms of thought.
There's a final influence that we haven't talked about much yet, the utopian socialists. These were a varied group of movements and thinkers that emerged out of the Enlightenment ideal of progress, reason and rights, that you could, in short, plan and design a society in which the needs of everyone could be fairly met.
The first was Francois-Noël Babeuf and his conspiracy of equals. Babeuf and his followers planned a coup during the French Revolution. His conspiracy of equals planned to implement absolute equality in France, with their manifesto reading, "We aspire to live and die equal the way we were born. We want real equality or death, this is what we need, and we'll have this real equality at whatever cost." Spoiler alert, Babeuf's conspiracy didn't end well for him. After the French Revolution came two figures, Henri de Saint-Simon and Charles Fourier. Saint-Simon distrusted democracy and the mob, but was an Enlightenment figure who believed that society could be organised in everyone's interests by men of science, that the state could technocratically plan society from the top down. He was an elitist figure in today's terms. Charles Fourier, on the other hand, argued that rational communes could be organised around universal principles of psychology that were based on different personality types who could each perform different jobs. Fourier was an eccentric and influential character who thought that the ideal commune would have exactly 1,620 people. Over in England and then America, Robert Owen argued that our characters were influenced by our environment, and so there should be a focus on education, reform and cooperatives. It was in Owen's Cooperative magazine in 1827 that the term socialist was likely used for the first time. Finally, during the 1848 revolutions, Louis Blanc argued for a dictatorship of the proletariat, without which he thought the forces of reaction, foreign, aristocratic, monarchical, etc. would simply retake power. He wrote that the provisional government should regard themselves as dictators appointed by a revolution which had become inevitable and which was under no obligation to seek the sanction of universal suffrage until after having accomplished all the good which the moment required.
What made all of these utopian? That you could conceptualise, idealistically, a rational, planned commune or society, a utopia, and build it like an engineer designing and building a building. This utopianism is what Marx rejected, but he still had one foot in this tradition.
In 1836, a group of German exiles in Paris, then London, formed a Communist League of the Just. Marx joined them and they changed their name to the Communist League in 1847. Marx and Engels worked up a manifesto in 1848, and at almost exactly the same time, by complete coincidence, a revolution broke out in Paris, which then spread across Europe. These revolutions differed from place to place, but communism was also just beginning to be taken a bit more seriously.
In 1848, Marx and a fellow Prussian named Engels wrote a small book which was to have a large effect on world history.
The Communist Manifesto began with these now famous lines: "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism." All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. It continued, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society at large, or in the common ruin of the contending classes."
The manifesto is short, the best introduction to Marx you can find, pretty easy to read, written to be popular, and contains most of Marx's most important early ideas, ending with those famous lines, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains."
It was in this early period that Marx discovered the next big piece of his puzzle.
The bourgeoisie and the ruling classes could never be philosopher kings or leaders in Plato's or Hegel's sense, because no one stands above and separate from the system, like God looking down, pulling the strings. The rulers are part of the system. They benefit from it, and so change necessarily has to come from elsewhere.
The proletariat, workers who must sell their alienated, estranged labour, who understand money as alienation, who work materially, physically at the ground level, they are the forces of change. Petrucciani writes, "The proletariat is the class that lives through the most complete negation and which therefore becomes itself the subject able to deny all existing relations."
This is why the call of the manifesto and the Communist League slogan was "Working men of all countries unite." It was through this that Marx argued that the material conditions produce ideas, but then ideas can then influence and change material life, reality.
Marx wrote, "The weapon of criticism cannot, of course, replace criticism by weapons. Material force must be overthrown by material force. But theory also becomes a material force as soon as it has gripped the masses."
For Marx, this wasn't a moral argument, it was a historical, economic, dialectical one, a scientific one, a matter of forces. One class was getting richer, the other immiserated. Reactionary, aristocratic, monarchical, despotic governments were holding on to power across Europe and using increasingly suppressive tactics. The continent was becoming a pressure cooker once again, and Marx believed that real revolution would come.
He wrote, "Revolution is possible only in the periods when both these factors, the modern productive forces and the bourgeois forms of production, come into collision with each other. A new revolution is possible only in consequence of a new crisis. It is, however, just as certain as this crisis." The manifesto brought all of these early themes we've looked at together. However, while it was initially printed thousands of times, it fell into obscurity for over 20 years before becoming more influential in the 1870s. And in those 20 years, crises and slumps would come and go, and Marx kept thinking a revolution was right around the corner. But capitalism, railways, factories, steamships, and colonialism kept on expanding. Trade unions began organising for the first time, having previously been banned in many countries, and socialists and anarchists formed the International Working Men's Association in 1864, shortened now to the First International.
And so, as he waited for revolution, Marx sat down to write his magnum opus, an analysis of the entire system. At this point, Marx is juggling some of the most modern ideas that he's found around him. He knows he wants to ground his work materially, but he needs a concrete place to start.
Because for Marx, capitalism is dynamic, dialectical, in motion. He knows it's transformative. For this reason, it's important, I think, to remember that Capital, a critique of political economy, or Das Kapital, or simply Capital, published in 1867, is not meant as a universal truth, but a snapshot of the European capitalism of the period, and the societal laws that Marx thinks emerge from it. It's a hugely ambitious, diverse book, full of references to literature, economics, and philosophical ideas, the politics and culture of the period. Furthermore, it's only the first of 3 volumes, the second and third being left in notes at the time of Marx's death and compiled by Engels, and on top of that there were meant to be 6 volumes originally, looking at things like land, the state, and the world market.
So it's impossible to do justice. Even most of Marx's detractors don't deny that Capital is a masterpiece. Agree with its conclusions or not, reading it and understanding it is indispensable for understanding our modern world.
The themes are varied, but the most important are these. The question of what we value and why, what gives things their monetary value, say, and how we value their usefulness, then labour and work, what motivates them, what's at the root of them, then capital and wealth and how they function and circulate, and then the forces, the movements, the contradictions that arise from the relationships between all of these.
The simplest way to understand what Marx is saying is this, that capital is an impersonal force, like gravity, or meteorology or mathematics. It has a life of its own.
Which is why Marx believed that what he was doing was science. It wasn't speculative in the sense of philosophers thinking up ideas in dusty studies. Capital is full of references to statistics and factory routines. It's rich and dense in descriptions of how craftsmen use different instruments and pamphlets and parliamentary debates, and all of this was very rare for the time. In this sense, it's a very modern history, drawing on lots of evidence of 19th century capitalism. Marx was a man of the Enlightenment, maybe one of the last great Enlightenment system builders, inspired by people like Newton and the idea that there are recognisable scientific forces, laws of motion, at play in both the natural world and in human societies.
The key for Marx was to search around, to peel away, to zoom in, to interrogate, like astronomers and scientists do, to find the kernel, the hidden truth at the core of history itself. So, where does Marx begin? With something that's all around us, that's at the core of capitalism and all of our lives, that we cannot do without, and may contain some secrets. The commodity.
What is it then, this mysterious thing that we call a commodity? It's not obvious from the surface of them. They're all so different after all. There's almost nothing that unites them, that they have in common. A bus ticket so different from an iPhone. A movie on DVD so different from a carefully crafted table. But Marx wants to find a concept, a definition of sorts that unites them all. The most obvious that he realised first is that despite all their differences, one being a food and another being a toy, they all have a use to someone. They all have a use value. So that's one side of a commodity. But they also have a price, an exchange value. And that is something they all have in common.
What Marx finds immediately interesting is that neither of these are in the commodity. They can't be found anywhere by simply examining it, by taking it apart. They're not inherent in it. So these values must come from somewhere else.
He writes, "We may twist and turn a single commodity as we wish, it remains impossible to grasp as a thing possessing value."
Okay, so everything has these price tags on, so that's where the price comes from. But where does that come from? Maybe just from use value, usefulness, how useful we find each commodity.
But everyone finds different things useful. Diamond rings aren't that useful, but they're certainly expensive. Water is very useful, but is very cheap. I might hate Picasso and not find his art useful to me, useful to my aesthetic pleasure, but I definitely wouldn't turn down someone giving me a free Picasso painting because I know it's worth something else. Its value isn't just defined by its use value to me. So what is the mysterious exchange value based on? Marx points out that if I offer my 3 apples for your 3 onions, there must be some metric, some common idea that we're basing our appraisal of what each is worth on. Why is it that all commodities are comparable if they have nothing else in common? There must be something, otherwise we wouldn't be able to compare them on the same plane, by the same metric. We need a kind of ruler, a measuring tape, to understand what's going on here.
The simple answer is that the price tag, or the exchange value, is the cost of producing the item. A phone costs more than an apple because it's more difficult to make. It takes more infrastructure, more machines, more attention, more supply chains. If I sell you a cake, for example, I add up the cost of all the ingredients to me and add a little bit more for my labour too.
But we get into an infinite regress. What determines the cost of flour? The cost of the machines at the phone factory? The cost of wood? Marx says that at the base, what all commodities have in common is that they're products of labour. Commodities, he says, congealed quantities of homogeneous human labour. And by homogeneous, he means this is the value. This is the homogeneous unit that unites the heterogeneity and all the differences of such a wide range of commodities. He says commodities have values only insofar as they are all expressions of an identical social substance, human labour. What he means is, yes, my cake is based on the cost of flour, sugar, bowls, etc. But at every stage in their production, human labour produced each part of it. The flour, the sugar, the bowls, the electricity. Even the factory walls, say, at the phone factory were built by someone, and they had to travel to the factory when they would build it, and they had to eat, and so on and so on. The sugar cane had to be farmed. And so exchange value is the totality of all of that put together, the total value of the long line of production that came before the commodity.
What Marx has immediately reached is the social value hidden behind the price tag. He says the object has a phantom-like objectivity.
In his incredible and influential guide to Das Kapital, David Harvey writes, "Value is a social relation, and you cannot actually see, touch or feel social relations directly, yet they have an objective presence." What he means is they objectively existed, the process objectively happened. We can bring this back to Marx's idea about species being. The value is something social, not individual. Otherwise, how would you ever get to something called a fair price, a correct price, something to judge what your offer, say, is made on? When you reject the price of something, you often say something like, "I could have made it for less than that." What you're doing here is invoking a labour theory of value. It's a kind of hidden pattern that connects me to the rest of society. Like Hegel before him, it isn't the thing in its particularity, in its singleness, the commodity, that particular toy, say, that has an essential truth within it, but the relationships between things that really matter.
Why does this matter? Value is a difficult idea to grasp, but it's at the heart of almost everything. What we value is what we want more of, what we're less likely to give away. Does, for example, how we value food differ from how we value friendship or democracy? Does value differ across different political and economic systems? If we can get to the bottom of how and why we value things, we can use that as a basis for good arguments, good philosophy, and good economics.
Marx came across the labour theory of value when he was reading the classical economists. The Scottish economist Adam Smith had first used the idea to describe how wealth came from production and industry rather than land, but he also said it came from capitalist investment and rent too. Then the British economist David Ricardo went further, arguing all value comes directly from the amount of labour time needed to produce a good. Ricardo, though interested in making sure land and industry was productive rather than wasted, didn't take the next logical step in asking why. If labour creates value, why did capitalists get rich and labourers stay poor? This was left to Marx. Okay, so for Marx, the more effort, the longer, the more difficult it is to produce something, the more work and labour it takes, the more value it has.
But there's a problem here. I might be very slow at making this box of cereal. I might be bad at it, and a competitor might do it better, quicker, and easier. Despite this, they will likely sell it at a higher price. So despite my labour time being higher, the outcome of my shoddy work is worth less. Surely this contradicts the labour theory of value.
For Marx, remember, value is a social phenomenon.
Things might have different use values. I might find this useful, but you might find it useless. But when we're thinking about what it's worth to society, to everyone, on average, what price we can get for it, what's going on behind the scenes of that calculation?
Value, he says, is socially necessary labour time, which is, he writes, the labour time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal for a given society and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labour prevalent in that society. Petrucciani puts it like this. Why socially necessary? Because empirically, it can happen that a slow or incapable producer takes more time than a skilled and quick one to make the same object, say a chair. It would make no sense to say that an inefficiently produced chair is worth more, and thus Marx makes value equal to the average labour time which is needed to produce a given good. When we come together to judge value socially, we're not interested in how long it took the individual manufacturer, say, like we're walking along a line of market stalls who are all selling the same products, we're comparing them in the aggregate. We're comparing them and judging them next to each other. We're averaging everything out and appraising it. Marx writes, the sum total of the labour of all these private individuals form the aggregate labour of society. Since the producers do not come into social contact until they exchange the products of their labour, the specific social characteristics of their private labours appear only within this exchange. That value is socially necessary labour time forces producers into a single system. Each has to compare with one another, compete in the market, keep up with the latest innovations. If I take too long to make an inferior product to you and it's not going to sell, I'll be undercut by you or the person on the market stall next to me.
This is precisely Marx's method, that dialectical reversal, the turning of Hegel on his head. He's gone and looked at the world materially, at the work, products, physical goods and factories, and from that empirical study in the library, taken lots of diverse, heterogeneous ideas and exchanges and identified one single, homogeneous, abstract concept, the labour theory of value.
He writes, concrete labour time becomes the form of manifestation of its opposite, abstract human labour. And remember, labour itself has a value. If I employ 10 workers, I need to pay them enough to feed them, shelter them, make sure they have enough energy to work. Then that amount paid to them has to at least be in the price or the value of the end product. It has to be transferred. Their labour, the energy goes directly into the product.
So the value of labour is the cost of maintaining that labour. If all of the food and the getting to work and the rent costs £100, say, and then it produces 100 of these tiny toy bottles of milk, then all other things being equal, these are worth £1 each.
Marx writes, if the workers could live on air, it would not be possible to buy them at any price. The constant tendency of capital is to force the cost of labour back towards this absolute zero. It's only through the fact that labourers need things, that their labour power costs a certain amount, that makes the value of that pass through into a commodity. Once we have a universal measure that unites all commodities, the amount of labour embodied within them, the socially necessary labour time, then that unit, that appraisal, that number can be represented or symbolised by something else, money.
Next. Just like in Hegel, as one shape develops into another, the idea that an object can have an exchange value based on how much labour went into it can develop logically into the idea of money to represent that value. Importantly, what we have here is movement, dynamism, development.
Marx writes, the money form is merely the reflection thrown upon a single commodity by the relations between all other commodities. In other words, it's that social value, abstracted. It's all of that socially necessary labour in its reality, in its physicality, in its movement, in its doing stuff, made into an abstract number, an abstract value represented then by a unit, money. But money does something else too. It measures value, but it also provides a kind of lubricant that enables exchanges to happen easier. Money is both a measure of value and a means of circulation. However, just like there's a contradiction between use value and exchange value, between what an object's usefulness is to you and how much it's worth on the market, there's also a contradiction within money itself. It being a measure of value is different to it being a means of circulation, because money can be saved up, hoarded, hidden and stashed. I could take it all, and there'd be no means of circulation left whatsoever. Harvey writes, what happens to the circulation of commodities in general if everybody suddenly decides to hold on to money? The buying of commodities would cease and circulation would stop, resulting in a generalized crisis.
Sure, you can hoard grain or bread or milk, but money is obviously different. It lasts longer, it's more efficient, you can do more with it, everyone wants it, and yeah, it doesn't spoil as much.
It's here for Marx that capitalism really starts to take off. People want money not just to pay for the necessities of life, but want it for its own sake. Modern society, Marx writes, greets gold as its holy grail, as the glittering incarnation of its innermost principle of life.
Here we have accumulation, the root of some being able to lend money to others, to command interest rates, to get richer. We have what Marx calls primitive accumulation, the building up of capital itself, large amounts of disposable money.
Petrucciani says, the same attitude which appeared manic in the hoarder becomes ironclad rationality in the capitalist. The capitalist incarnates an insatiable desire for gain. Marx uses a formula. It used to be that a commodity would be exchanged for money to buy another commodity. Sell an apple to buy a chair, C for commodity, to M for money, into C again for a new commodity, CMC. But under capitalism, that starts to reverse. Money can be used to buy commodities to sell for a profit, more money. Instead of CMC, commodity, money, commodity, we get MCM, money, commodity, money. Instead of a new commodity being the goal, selling the apple to get yourself a chair, say, money itself becomes the goal. But Marx points out the curious fact that if you're swapping a number of apples for a chair, say, they can both be worth exactly the same, and you can still get what you want from the deal, the apple or the chair. He says, where equality exists, there is not gain. But if you're using money to buy commodities to make a profit, where does the extra money come from at the end, in that second M in the MCM? Why would you do the exchange if some gain wasn't going to come from it? If CMC, cup for money to buy food, is zero sum, each are worth the same, you're just getting a different product, a different commodity that you need, why is MCM positive sum? Why is it that the goal of the last M is more than the first M? Where does that extra come from? Marx says that under capitalism, for the first time, this appears as if a mystery. He writes, capital is money, capital is commodities. By virtue of being value, it has acquired the occult ability to add value to itself. It brings forth living offspring, or at least lays golden eggs. Now remember, all value must come from labour, people putting work into things. But when we start really using money, value becomes mysterious, as if taken over by money, as if money has magical powers and is the source of value itself, rather than being meaningless pieces of paper or chunks of metal.
Marx calls this commodity fetishism. He says there's a magic of money that conceals what's going on underneath, that conceals the very human work underneath. He calls it a riddle to be solved. And with Marx, there's always something going on under the surface of concrete things. He's always moving from particular stuff to broader, universal social phenomena. Commodities, he says, are sensuous things, which at the same time are supra-sensible and social.
He writes, The mysterious character of the commodity form consists simply in the fact that the commodity reflects the social characteristics of men's own labour as objective characteristics of the products of labour themselves, as the socio-natural properties of these things. Under capitalism, you can buy a fancy new shirt, but the objective conditions of production can be very hidden. Sweatshops, unethical business practices, the devastation of the environment are all happening elsewhere, under the surface, and money can hide it. Commodities can appear on the shelves as if by magic. Petrucciani puts it like this: fetishism would be that attitude according to which commodities are endowed with value as if it belonged to them by nature, rather than because of the specific modality of their production. Commodities and money are hieroglyphs to be decoded and understood. They're curtains to be drawn back and peered through. There's always something real, something material, something physical, something understandable behind them. But we too easily forget this. Marx writes, "It is, however, precisely this finished form of the world of commodities, the money form, which conceals the social character of private labour and the social relations between the individual workers by making those relations appear as relations between material objects instead of revealing them plainly."
So what's going on behind the surface? How does the capitalist lay a golden egg? Why does the last M of the MCM magically contain more money than the first M?
To uncover the secret, to peel back the layers, to dispel the illusion of commodity fetishism, we have to go somewhere that philosophy doesn't ordinarily tread. Marx says we have to go into the hidden abode of production, on whose threshold there hangs the notice, no admittance except on business. We have to go through the factory doors.
Let's visit a typical factory.
It's only here that the riddle of profit can be solved, how value can be miraculously created from nowhere, emerging like that golden egg. After all, value can only be made from people doing work, labouring.
In factories, people work together at machines to make many of the products that help us live better and easier.
If someone has a hoard, a stash, a windfall of money, what can they do with it to increase it? How can they increase that last M in the MCM cycle? The capitalist searches around for a commodity that can expand in value, and they find it, most obviously, in people themselves.
If I'm putting together a new product out of wood and nails and wires, whatever it is, I need labour to help me do it too. In this sense, labour power is a commodity like any other. I can go to the market and buy my wood, and I can go to the market and, under capitalism, hire labour.
The products made in a factory take a great deal of planning, preparation, and work on the part of many people.
Marx writes, the possessor of money does find such a special commodity on the market, the capacity for labour. In other words, labour power. To purchase or rent labour power, the labourer must be free to sell it. They must be freed from servitude as peasants or slaves, for example. They must then have nothing and need something, need a means of subsistence. On the one hand, there are those that have access to estates with vegetable patches and fields and forests and woods. And then, on the other hand, after feudalism and slavery is abolished, there are those that are forced from the land, prohibited from collecting wood or using common land to grow food or graze animals. Marx writes, nature does not produce on the one hand owners of money or commodities and on the other hand men possessing nothing but their labour power. This relation has no basis in natural history, nor does it have a social basis common to all periods of human history. It is clearly the result of a past historical development. what Adam Smith described as that natural tendency to truck trade and barter, isn't natural, but is historical. It developed, it changed, and so it cannot be natural. Now, here is the core of Marx's argument. It is that labour power is a commodity like any other. The labourer, wandering, searching, looking for work, needs a certain level of sustenance, of food, shelter, of welfare, that itself has to be provided, at least in part, by the labour power of other labourers.
So the value or cost of labour power is the value or cost of producing all of the energy that energises and sustains that labour power in the labourer, meaning labour power is comparable to any other commodity. It has a value, and that value, like every other commodity, is determined by the labour theory of value. How much labour, food production, building shelter, collecting water and so on, goes into sustaining and energising the worker doing the work.
Let's save the talk. Can't we agree that capitalism is an economic system? A system for the production and distribution of things we need and want?
I won't agree to that.
So the capitalist has capital, and they can spend that money on raw materials, supplies, and they can buy labour power. They can combine it all together.
And Marx assumes that all of this is purchased at the correct price, that the value of everything is determined by how much labour went into making it. If it costs me $5 to get the energy and the sleep and the shelter, to hammer the nails for 1 hour, that's how much the labour power is worth, $5 per hour.
That labour power is combined or mixed with the wood and the nails, and then the capitalist sells on. But again, he sells on for a profit. It has to sell for more than the combined value of the labour power and the materials. The second MCM must be greater. Where is this extra, this surplus coming from? If the labour theory of value is correct, it can only come from labour. So here's the key. Marx argues there's a gap between what it costs to sustain the labour over, say, a day, and what the capitalist gets out of the labourer in labour power over the course of that day. And this has to be where surplus value comes from.
So in the first part of the day, as an example, the labourer is working in return for wages that cover the cost of sustaining them, or what Marx calls reproducing the labour. And in the second part of the day, the labourer is also covering the cost of sustaining the capitalist's needs, their food and sustenance and shelter. But it's here, Marx argues, that the capitalist can suck more value out of the worker than they're being compensated for, that they can extract surplus value and make a profit.
He writes, wherever a part of society possesses the monopoly of the means of production, the worker, free or unfree, must add to the labour time necessary for his own maintenance an extra quantity of labour time in order to produce the means of subsistence for the owner of the means of production.
So he argues that humans are just capital like everything else. Material, muscle, machinery that can be bought and sold and hired and their energy put to use. But that humans are a special type of capital, variable capital.
Humans are fleshy, muscly, malleable, mouldable and innovative things that are highly variable in the ways they can perform. So the capitalist can push a human to work harder, faster, differently, so as to squeeze more energy out of them. Unlike nails or buildings, humans have more variability. Machines, on the other hand, spinning wheels, hammers, lathes, factory equipment, buildings, metals and raw materials are constant capital, in contrast to variable capital, humans. Machines and buildings and static stuff, they all move, spin, weave, hammer and screw at a pretty constant, steady, inflexible rate.
Because the machines have made all kinds of new things that people need, and made so many of them that the price can be brought down where everybody can buy those things.
So, their value is the amount it costs to produce them, and they can pass that value into the end product. The nails contribute to the total value of the table, for example. But stuff like this cannot magically create value out of thin air. The value they transmit is constant.
A new value must come from somewhere else, and it's human labour that's variable. It can change in speed, efficacy, length, strength, and dexterity. Machines don't vary, don't go on strike, don't get sick. They can't be shouted at or disciplined or threatened. They are predictable. But if you can get more work out of a worker or workers, then you can get more value into that final product. You can extract more surplus value. Labour, variable capital, can be organised in different ways. They can be made more productive by dividing them up and getting them to perform smaller, more repetitive tasks, working out ways to improve efficiency. Their lunch breaks can be shortened, or you could even provide meals if you think that will give them more energy and make them more productive. The point here is that it's variable. Harvey writes, surplus value arises because workers labour beyond the number of hours it takes to reproduce the value equivalent of their labour power. How many extra hours do they work? That depends on the length of the working day.
As we'll come back to, Marx spends many pages in Capital describing the English working class struggles to shorten the length of the working day. In the 19th century, the capitalist class in factories here in the Midlands of England did everything they could to lengthen them, to employ women and children in dirty and unsafe factories, to cut costs and to get the most out of labour that they possibly could. Marx calls all of this small thefts of the workers' time and the petty pilfering of minutes, or the snatching of minutes.
If a single capitalist gets more end product, more tables say, from their workers in one working day for the same amount of wages, they can either sell them cheaper than their competitors or for the same amount and keep more profit. But the logic of capitalism, of competition, is such that if you don't, your competitor will. This is fundamental to Marx.
He's not so dogmatic as to argue that this happens all of the time, everywhere, or that capitalists are purposefully cruel and evil, only that there's a logic, a motivation, a force that compels capital to operate in this way, or else someone else will do it elsewhere and make a cheaper product.
He writes, the influence of individual capitals on one another has the effect precisely that they must conduct themselves as capital. In other words, capital is a total system that has a logic of its own, independent of individual capitalists.
There is downward pressure on wages and pressure to increase productivity, not to get rich, but just to keep up. Marx writes, the minimum wage is the centre towards which the current rates of wages gravitate.
There might be some cultural expectations about the minimum wage, say, about safe working conditions. There might be regulations and oversight and nosy journalists here and there that push wages up slightly and advocate for improved safety or more holiday time. But ultimately, there is a force putting downward pressure on wages. If the capitalist pays the labourer more than all of his or her competitors out of the kindness of their heart, then the end product costs more and they end up going out of business. If they shorten the working day while their competitor lengthens it and becomes more productive and so makes a cheaper product, they go out of business. This is why individual capitals turn into a single homogeneous capital, and capital becomes an inhuman force. It has a magical effect on all of those under its spell, forcing them into the logic of capitalist production. Das Kapital is full of literary references. From Shakespeare to Romantic influences, they pop up everywhere. He writes things like, "Capital has a voracious appetite, a werewolf-like hunger for surplus labour, and the vampire will not let go while there remains a single muscle, sinew, or drop of blood to be exploited." And that capital is dead labour, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labour, and lives the more labour it sucks.
He's calling machines dead labour because their value comes from the living labour that was transferred into them when they were made. Das Kapital is a book of flows, of energy transfer, of how value moves dynamically through the world dialectically, how the workers' labour power is alienated, taken from them, and how, as we'll see, that flow of energy and value keeps moving inexorably from the worker class into the capitalist class. Okay, we'll return to that relationship between labour and capital because that is the crux of it. That is the Hegelian contradiction. One pulls on the other, creating discord, but we need to supplement it with a few more basic concepts.
Remember, Marx is trying to be scientific. He looks around and sees what happens a lot, then builds from that observation, that empirical work, from the ground up into broader concepts, specifically looking at 19th century capitalism. Two main concepts he identifies are the forces of production and the relations of production. The forces of production are the material, the buildings, tools, technology, instruments and factories of any given society. The relations of production are the social relationships that underpin the division of ownership and division of labour in any given society. The classes, the relationships between them, who owns and who doesn't, how a society is organised. Combined, these make up a mode of production. In the German ideology, Marx wrote, "A certain mode of production, or industrial stage, is always combined with a certain mode of cooperation, or social stage, and this mode of cooperation is itself a productive force."
Importantly, Marx points out how these modes of production have changed across history.
There was primitive communism, where tribes and primitive societies held resources broadly in common. There was slavery, where one class is held in bondage to labour and another is free to trade them. There was a feudal mode, where peasants are tied to the land and produce their own means of subsistence, but are obliged to provide for their lord in return for hypothetical protection and access to the lord's land. Then there's the bourgeois mode, capitalism. They change throughout history. Each, Marx writes, is replaced by a new one corresponding to the more developed productive forces, and hence to the advanced mode of the self-activity of individuals. As contradictions appear within each mode, one mode is replaced by another in a Hegelian way.
This is why Marx is a materialist, not an idealist. When you look at the development of societies across history, it's not the ideas of individuals that matter so much to the majority, but the type of economic system, the mode of production that has the biggest influence on how they and we live our lives. And classes, peasants, lords, slaves, proletariat, kings, the bourgeoisie, are at the root of this.
Kalinikos writes, "Classes arise when the direct producers have been separated from the means of production, which have become the monopoly of a minority."
But what about ideas? They're everywhere. Surely they have their place. Marx calls all of this the economic base, but argues there's a superstructure over the top. So the base is the economic relations and the forces of production, slaves, tools, farming, computers, serfs, the forces and the class divisions, and the superstructure arises from that in the form of norms, political assumptions, laws, even culture and art, and so on.
Marx writes, the sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation, on which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. This mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness.
Now, the superstructure aims to justify the economic structure. Wages being kept low? Well, we have to be productive or else China will beat us. Capitalism is harmful? Read Ayn Rand. I had no choice but to shoplift the baby food. I understand that, but property is property. Have you not read your John Locke, young lady?
Marx writes, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e. the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force, the class which has the means of production at its disposal, consequently also controls the means of mental production, so that the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are on the whole subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relations, grasped as ideas.
And one of the biggest superstructural myths, Marx says, is that the bourgeoisie have the power to tell tales about their thrift, their ingenuity, their creative genius, and that value comes from their prowess, their endless revolutionizing of technology, their inventiveness. Like money, like commodities, we often see machines as magical things. We fetishize them. We think that they can do things, create things, produce things out of thin air. We forget that they conceal social relationships and processes and physical lives, real things that have happened to people and that people have done underneath the surface.
One compelling advantage that Marx's theory of history has is that it explains technological development. It explains why the Industrial Revolution seemed to take off at the same time as capitalism. Other theories, like innovations being the result of genius individuals, struggle to explain the wider historical trends of technological progress. In Marx, instead, technological development is fundamental to his theory and to how history moves.
We've seen that one way for the capitalist to extract surplus value is to try to lengthen the working day, to improve the efficiency of labour by dividing workers up to perform smaller tasks, or to increase the intensity of work through discipline. In short, in finding ways of making labour more productive by getting more out of them in the same amount of time. But there's another way of increasing productivity, and that's with technology.
All of the spinning wheels and water frames and engines of the Industrial Revolution were making labour more efficient. You could make more clothes, for example, in the same amount of time employing fewer workers. Now, importantly, the machines still need labour. They're all built by people. They need attending, need loading, need maintenance, need correcting if something goes wrong, and so on. But they're all what Marx calls labour-saving devices. They make work more productive, and so more surplus value can be extracted from the same amount of work. Marx writes, machinery is intended to cheapen commodities and, by shortening the part of the working day in which the worker works for himself, and to lengthen the other part, the part he gives the capitalist for nothing, The machine is a means of producing surplus value.
Through technological innovation, we get more or better end products out of less labour power. Less labour power means lower wages have to be paid. Competitors can then be undercut and more profit can flow to the innovative capitalist relative to the others in that particular industry.
Marx says the individual value of these articles is now below their social value. In other words, they have cost less labour time than the great bulk of the same article produced under the average social conditions.
Now though, something interesting happens. The competitors either have to copy, keep up, innovate themselves, or go out of business.
When the competitors adopt the new machinery, the new innovation, the first capitalist can no longer undercut them, and they compete for the best price again, bringing the profits back down to where they were originally. So the first mover capitalist has the advantage when they innovate, but this doesn't last long. They're up against the clock. And so the search for a new innovation, new technology, new labour-saving devices continues. Marx writes, the extra surplus value vanishes as soon as the new method of production is generalised, and then the difference between the individual value of the cheapened commodity and its social value vanishes. We can see the dialectical influence at play here. The particular actions of one lead to a generalised universal process that draws all in, which again returns to affect the particular individual, which returns to the generalised universal, and so on. He continues, capital therefore has an immanent drive and a constant tendency towards increasing the productivity of labour in order to cheapen commodities and, by cheapening commodities, to cheapen the worker himself.
Again, this shows how capital becomes an inhuman, alien, vampire-like force. It compels people to act in a certain way, to search out labour-saving methods, to improve technology, to innovate, to compete, to try to underpay, to discipline. And it compels others to follow or copy or keep up or go bankrupt. If you don't search for productivity, for efficiency, your competitor will. Capitalism becomes a race against the clock.
It's all about incentives and pressures and forces within the total system, which is why Marx believed what he was doing was a science in the same way Newton studied gravity, laws of attraction, forces that act on people, pushing them to act in certain ways.
Even after the machine is paid for, there's an incentive to use it as much as possible unless it wears out, rusts away, gets replaced by better machines. Imagine the complexity and ingenuity of getting a water frame running or a steam engine working properly in a factory in the 19th century. Once it's working 24/7, the reflexive impulse to find workers, to man it as much as possible, to get as much from the machine as possible before it breaks or something, must have been compulsively huge.
Men and jobs do this. People at machines, people in offices, and people in the shops and mines and mills of this country. Men and jobs are the essential basis of our modern America.
Marx writes, competition subordinates every individual capitalist to the immanent laws of capitalist production as external and coercive laws. It compels him to keep extending his capital so as to preserve it, and he can only extend it by means of progressive accumulation. But notice a new stage of development. As they compete to keep up, we have larger, bigger, more technologically advanced companies. As technology improves, any industry requires more capital, more initial outlay to even get started. The barriers to entry get higher. Some can't keep up, can't copy machines, can't innovate, and either go bust or get bought out and incorporated into the more successful, bigger businesses. And importantly, fewer workers are needed to produce the same amount of products as they get replaced slowly by more and more machinery.
You know, Lowell, I can tell you what's wrong with the country today. It's the machine age. Everywhere you look, it's machines, machines, machines. That's the trouble. The machines have got all the jobs. And
Kallinikos puts it like this. Concentration takes place when capitals grow in size through the accumulation of surplus value. Centralization, on the other hand, involves the absorption of smaller by bigger capitals. The process of competition itself encourages this trend, because the more efficient firms are able to undercut their rivals and then to take them over. But economic recessions speed up the process by enabling the surviving capitals to buy up the means of production cheap.
I think Marx answers a fundamental question about modernity here. Why does technology, which should save us all time, its labour-saving devices, not make our lives easier? Not make our lives better? Why are we all not fishing and playing guitar and camping while machines do our bidding? Only Marx provides a compelling structural answer to this.
there's something here that gives a lot of people indigestion of a different kind. And I'll tell you what it is. It's a mechanical gadget that can make more donuts in 10 minutes than Mother could make in 10 days.
Well, well, the old sinker has gone mechanical. Say, that machine's a honey, isn't it?
Well, it certainly does everything.
Because machines, owned by a few, extract productivity from the rest. And the motivation to increase productivity is the desire to sell more and sell cheaper. So while capitalism makes some things cheaper, workers, and that's a lot of us, are also commodities, subject to the same forces, the same pressure on wages, on time, on hours, on improving productivity. It becomes a vicious circle.
Why, everywhere you look, some machine's doing the work that ought to be done by men. Everything's machine, machine, machine. The thing's got out of control.
He writes simply that the machine is a means for producing surplus value. He compares it to the old traditional way of handicrafts, pointing to how the old worker, like a woodworker say, would make use of a tool, while in the new factory, the machine makes use of him. Machines, quote, dominate and soak up living labour power. Technology then is a double-edged sword. It can improve our lives, but spurs competition, leads to concentration, increases barriers of entry, makes it harder for startups to compete, and can put more and more out of work. Where capitalism starts in small-scale artisan workshops, it ends in highly advanced, labour-trampling, inhuman, surplus value extracting global technological conglomerates.
Capitalism preys on whatever it can find, sucking surplus into bigger and bigger piles, larger and larger factories, seeking out new markets. Anything that can be commodified will be. In short, all that is solid melts into air.
We too often think of history as causal or linear, that one thing causes the next thing like a row of dominoes falling over. Dialectical thinking takes a different approach. Instead of a linear axis, calculator, microchip, computer, smartphone, VR, AI, say, or slave, peasant, proletariat, bourgeoisie, etc., we have a dialectical one where at any given moment in time, in the axis, there's a mutual relationship between elements, and that when there is incongruence or incompatibility or friction between them, transformation is forced. It's what Hegel called sublation. In other words, it's not simple linear progress along one axis, but multiple axes interacting with each other mutually that forces change between them.
We've seen how the interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie are at odds, how they contradict one another. One wants higher wages, the other wants lower. One wants to get home, the other wants higher productivity.
In the Grundrisse, an unpublished manuscript and notes of his economic thinking, Marx wrote, "The growing incompatibility between the productive development of society and its hitherto existing relations of production expresses itself in bitter contradictions, crises, spasms. The technology owned by the bourgeoisie is at odds with the wages of the worker. Machines put people out of work and create a reserve labour force. The instrument of labour strikes down the worker," Marx writes. "Even if it's transitional and more work is found eventually, there is a period at least of unemployment, a period of crisis for displaced workers. Not only does this happen because of technology, but this can be good for the capitalist. If there's a reserve labour force, then it makes it harder for workers to negotiate for higher wages, because there's always someone over there willing to work for less just to work. Capitalists get more and more value out of fewer and fewer workers. Workers are displaced and squeezed."
Now the bourgeoisie can keep revolutionising, building different machines, finding new markets so new jobs might be created. It's not the case that absolute poverty for the proletariat is inevitable, although it's certainly possible. What will happen is that as the bourgeoisie acquire more and more capital, more and more machines and technology, and as many are put out of work, then the proletariat will be relatively immiserated compared with the bourgeoisie.
Petrucciani puts it like this: "Marx can thus conclude by claiming that the absolute general law of capitalist accumulation is to constantly produce, in the direct ratio of its own energy and extent, an excess of workers, a reserve army whose poverty increases as the power of wealth grows. These conclusions are of course very bleak, appropriately so, because Marx aims to show, among other things, how capitalism is socially unsustainable."
This relative immiseration means there's more concentration into larger monopolies on the one hand, and more fragmentation and discord on the other. Each are incompatible.
Engels wrote, "Productive forces are concentrated in the hands of a few bourgeois, whilst the great mass of the people are more and more becoming proletarians, and their condition more wretched and unendurable in the same measure in which the riches of the bourgeois increase." On top of this, map the unpredictability of capitalism, its booms and busts, overproduction leading to crises, gluts, market instabilities, contradictions, further bankruptcies and buyouts, mass unemployment, and you have an explosive situation.
All of this is the apex of the argument in Capital, a tendency towards catastrophe.
A key concept here is that the overall rate of profit falls. If value, and therefore profit, comes from labour, and there is increasingly less labour, fewer people doing the same amount of work because there's more and more machines, technology, infrastructure, and so on, what Marx calls the organic composition of capital, the rate of surplus value being extracted can only decrease over time. Doing business gets harder. Being a proletariat gets harder still.
Again, the contradiction and irony that by improving productivity and investing more and more, the capitalist class are sowing the seeds of their own destruction.
Marx writes, "What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, is its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable."
What we have is a pressure cooker on a societal scale.
Let's just recap and look at the ingredients thrown into this explosive pot. First, division of labour. Workers are fragmented into performing meaningless single repetitive tasks. It alienates and dehumanises them. Then the downward pressure on wages and relative impoverishment between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. A reserve labour army with no work at all. Booms and busts, overproduction, layoffs, takeovers, recessions. then bigger, more monstrous companies that are impossible to compete with, concentration and monopolies, centralisation, and then the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. All of this pulls on two poles. On the one, accumulate, Marx says. On the other, though, is something that emerges out of the chaos, a class consciousness, meaning a privileged position, a unique conscious state arising out of the material conditions of all of this, a perspective, a consciousness that understands their place in history, simply the proletariat. Harvey puts it like this: this is typical Marx. There are countervailing tendencies at work. Concentration on the one hand, subdivision and fragmentation on the other. Where is the balance between them? Who knows? The balance between concentration and decentralisation is almost certainly subject to perpetual flux. The capitalist will outsource, subcontract, lay off, divide and conquer. If the proletariat doesn't join together, all of this will mutilate the labourer into a fragment of a man, degrade him to the level of an appendage of a machine, destroy any remnant of attraction in his work and turn it into a hated toil. They estrange from him the intellectual potentialities, they distort the conditions under which he works, and subject him during the labour process to a despotism the more hateful for its meanness. They transform his lifetime into working time, and drag his wife and child beneath the wheels of the juggernaut of capital.
The only option for the proletariat is to join together and fight. Engels wrote that for the protection against the serpent of their agonies, the workers have to put their heads together. They have to cooperate. They have to join in union. It's not inevitable, but these forces, the incentives, all push workers into uniting. They all have the numbers, after all, to overthrow the current system.
There are long-standing debates about whether Marx was a determinist, whether he believes in inevitability of immiseration, of revolution, of human history itself, that we're all just puppets on a grander stage. I think he walks a fine line, but later on he largely tries to avoid writing in these deterministic terms. As Harvey says, there's not much causal language in Capital, just incentives and pressures and dialectical relationships that create these interesting pressure cookers that map on culture, politics, personal beliefs and many other things, and it creates a rich but complex picture of history. He says famously that men make their own history, but they do not make it just as they please. They do not make it under circumstances chosen by themselves, but under circumstances directly encountered, given and transmitted from the past. But none of this is a universal, inevitable schema that we all live under. There's just too much dynamism, too much change, too many variables and contingency. Marx himself even complained of those who tried to turn, quote, my historical sketch of the genesis of capitalism in Western Europe into a historico-philosophic theory of the general path every people is fated to tread, whatever the historical circumstances in which it finds itself. True to dialectical form, Marx says, circumstances create people in the same degree as people create circumstances.
However, the circumstances, the pressures, the forces are all pushing the proletariat to overthrow the current state of affairs and replace it with something new. Marx famously didn't say much about what he thought a communist society would look like. He was only emphatic that the proletariat needed to organise and overthrow the current system and do it themselves. He believed that this would require revolution, but that it might be peaceful in places. However, much of the rest he left scant details of his thoughts, and there was a particular reason for this.
As we've seen, he believed the proletariat had a particularly unique point of view that no one else, no other group in society had. Capitalists are compelled to act in the ways we've seen by the imperatives of the market. politicians are compelled to act by the power of big capital, but the proletariat in factories can experience all of this, feel their own immiseration, feel their alienation, and understand what negates them, understand industry, science and technology, and importantly, because of their proximity to one another, have the capacity to organise and change things.
Because of this, Marx believed that it should be left to the proletariat to establish the best course of action.
He was, in a sense, a rationalist. He believed that a better society could be organised rationally to the benefit of all instead of few. But he didn't believe that a rational society could be planned in advance, like the utopian socialists did. This is another expression of his dialectical thinking. He didn't believe in dogmatic, rigid, static systems, in universal sets of ideas, in ideology. Engels, for example, criticised those who did otherwise and tried to, quote, reduce the Marxist theory of development to a rigid orthodoxy which workers are not to reach as a result of their class consciousness, but which, like an article of faith, is to be forced down their throats at once and without development. The proletariat had to develop on their own. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx wrote, "Communists should not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mould the proletarian movement, because they have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole." And Engels wrote that the masses must have time and opportunity to develop, and they can have the opportunity only when they have a movement of their own, no matter in what form, so long as it is their movement, in which they are driven further by their mistakes and learn to profit by them.
However, they did leave some clues as to what they thought a communist society could look like.
Marx stated simply that we call communism the real movement which abolishes the present stage of things.
First, they famously argued for a dictatorship of the proletariat.
The proletariat would need to establish a class dictatorship of the proletariat as the necessary transit point to the abolition of class distinctions generally. Dictatorship obviously has a connotation today that it didn't have at the time. Their reading of revolution was dependent on the French Revolution, which was attacked by reactionary forces, both domestic and foreign, by the church, the aristocracy, civil war, and the monarchies of Europe. The bourgeoisie also held political power, so any immediate, popular, democratic vote would, and had in many places, often just bring the old regime back into power. Which is why they believed in a limited emergency dictatorship, not of one person, but by the proletariat as a class. Looking at how revolutions and democratic procedures were repressed across Europe, Marx believed that a bloody revolution was very likely, but he did equivocate and change his mind on this. He said in a speech, for example, that there are countries such as America, England and Holland where the working people may achieve their goal by peaceful means.
Okay, but what would happen once the revolution is secured? There are a few clues, but it should be remembered that these are comments here and there. The overarching image is of the proletariat working it out, depending on their particular experience of the system from where they are.
Marx pointed to the short-lived Paris Commune, which existed for a couple of months in 1871 when Parisian workers took control of Paris during the Franco-Prussian War. It was quickly defeated. Importantly, Marx wrote, the Commune was formed of the municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at short terms. He continued, like the rest of public servants, magistrates and judges were to be elected, responsible and revocable. Wage labour and capital should be abolished. Marx knew it would be difficult because society was, in every respect, economically, morally and intellectually still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. Because of this, he believed communism would develop in stages. At first, he said, accordingly, the individual producer receives back from society, after the deductions have been made, exactly what he gives to it. He receives a certificate from society that he has furnished such and such amount of labour. And with this certificate, he draws from the social stock of means of consumption as much as costs the same amount of labour. Petrucciani identifies the first step throughout the writings like this: landed estates are to be expropriated, inheritance rights abolished, strongly progressive taxation instituted, credit and transport nationalised, public factories built, and equal liability to work for all members of society imposed together with education of all children in national institutions at the expense of the nation. So at first there would be a mix of social democratic reforms, equalising of labour and reward for work, and the planning of industry in the interest of all. Kallinikos writes, the decisions about how much social labour would depend not on the blind workings of competition, but on a collective and democratic assessment by the associated producers in the light of the needs of society. But after a while, a higher stage of communism should be developed, which Marx puts like this. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labour, and therewith also the antithesis between mental and physical labour has vanished, after labour has become not only a means of life but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with all-around development of the individual and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
He thinks at this point that most people will want to work instead of being compelled to or incentivized to by monetary reward, say. That's each according to his ability, and that each will only take what he needs from the common stock, and that's to each according to his needs.
The state would then wither away. Engels wrote, as soon as there is no longer any social class to be held in subjection, as soon as class rule and the individual struggle for existence based upon our present anarchy and production, with the collisions and excesses arising from these are removed, nothing more remains to be repressed, and a special repressive force, a state, is no longer necessary.
Finally, it's important to note that Marx never wanted to promote absolute equality over individuality. He believed that having access to resources and contributing to how they were produced would mean individuals could flourish and their true creative individuality reached.
He called it an association in which the free development of each is the condition of the free development of all. In Engels' words, it's a humanity's leap from the kingdom of necessity to the kingdom of freedom. After the First International collapsed in 1876, Marx withdrew from political life, spending his time on further volumes of Capital, which he would never finish but would be published from his notes by Engels. In 1883, his daughter died, Marx then caught a cold, and himself died quietly in his sleep. Engels wrote, "Mankind is shorter by a head, and that the greatest head of our time."
Summing up, analysing or critiquing Marx's body of work is a huge task that's beyond the scope of this already too long video. His influence on the world, I think, is testament to the breadth of his insight, whether you agree or disagree with it. Much, I think, is due to the meticulous way he analysed the relationship between labour, capital and technology in Das Kapital, as a lot of the other insights before on things like alienation, revolution and socialism were much more common already and were likely to continue to be so without him. So what you think of Marx should depend on appraising those big ideas in Capital, and if anything, the jury is still out. I'll publish a more comprehensive appraisal on the second channel soon, but for now, I'll point towards some of the most common points of contention, some of the most common criticisms.
First, the Labour theory of value is probably criticised the most. Neoclassical economists emphasise the subjective nature of value, to put it simply, and there's a famous transformation problem in Marx in the literature, the problem of transforming labour value into actual numbers for profits and prices, which should be possible if the Labour theory of value is correct, but it doesn't seem to be.
All of this means that the Labour theory of value is wrong at worst and limited at best. However, even with the criticisms, it's undeniable that labour is at the core of production. And so how much labour goes into making something is at least one big part of the answer to value. That on its own makes Marx's insights very valuable.
Harvey writes, for example, "I have lost count of the number of times I have heard people complain that the problem with Marx is that he believes the only valid notion of value derives from labour inputs. It's not that at all. It's a historical social product. The problem, therefore, for a socialist, communist, revolutionary, anarchist or whatever, is to find an alternative value form that will work in terms of the social reproduction of society in a different image."
Falling rate of profit has also repeatedly been criticised. This is a key marker of whether capitalism can sustain itself over time. And Marx's contention was that because more technology would extract profit from fewer workers, the rate of profit would fall and capitalism would veer from crisis to crisis. The debate over this rages on, as of course does capitalism.
And Marx wouldn't be surprised. Capitalism's ability to transform is, as we've seen, one of its most distinctive features. Yet despite the dynamism, I think Marx would still recognise it today, which goes a long way to showing the enduring influence and insight of his work. Inequality, crises, banking crashes, squeezed wages, the speed of technological change, automation, global corporations, alienation. We're still very much in Marx's world. There's also the debate over actually existing socialism, the failures of centrally commanded economies, the USSR, and state capitalism. Yet many who follow Marx today would argue that these weren't socialist in the true Marxist sense. Marxism, Kalinikos writes, was socialism from below. It foresaw the working class liberating itself through its own activity and remaking society in its own image. Socialism in the Eastern Bloc, however, was based on the denial of the self-activity of the workers and the denial of popular democracy. There are also criticisms about how little Marx said about the practicalities of communism, how societies could function without money or without a state apparatus at all.
So Marx's relevance is difficult to escape from. And if you drop the idea that you have to be a Marxist or an anti-Marxist, a capitalist or a socialist, it's undeniable that his work contains still relevant insights and still useful analyses of still very present forces. He would want his readers to read and critique. He would want not to inspire followers, but change. In other words, he was emphatically not a dogmatist. He would want to inspire a different, fluid, active, creative type of thought, and importantly, action. Towards the end of his life, he said, "All I know is that I am no Marxist. God save me from my friends."
I'll end with a quote from a letter of Marx's called "For a Ruthless Criticism of Everything That Exists." He wrote in it, "We do not confront the world in a doctrinaire way with a new principle. Here is the truth, kneel down before it. We develop new principles for the world out of the world's own principles. We do not say to the world, cease your struggles, they are foolish. We will give you the true slogan of struggle. We merely show the world what it is really fighting for, and consciousness is something that it has to acquire, even if it does not want to."
Thank you to all of these incredible Patreon supporters. These videos take a long time to research, write and make. I do a lot of reading. They're always sourced and there's a bibliography in the description below. I've written something short on why I think this kind of well-researched long-form content is worth supporting. It's through the link below too. If you agree, then you can support Then and Now by pledging anything from $1 per month and get your name in credits, access to scripts early and become a member of the Discord server. If you can't do that, I know everyone says this, but please do subscribe, hit the bell, like, leave a comment. These things help with the algorithm so much. I'm also trying out a newsletter. I'm going to distill and summarize each video into a quick, easily digestible email for those who don't have time or want to recap, along with some related insights. Sign up below. As always, more than anything, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.